Good evening, I'm Judy Woodruff. On the NewsHour tonight, forced from their homes, facing floods, Hurricane Maria leaves Puerto Rico in the dark after the powerful storm devastates the Caribbean. Then searching for life in the rubble. As Mexico's death toll rises, rescuers hope to pull survivors from flattened buildings 4 days after that deadly quake. Plus, checking vital signs as Republicans' health care reform push suffers a setback. I sit down with Democratic Senator Tim Kaine about options for the future of Obamacare.
Everyone who has a big idea should put it on the table. Graham Cassidy is an idea. Fine, it's on the table. Bernie's got one, it's on the table. I would like there to be a publicly offered insurance policy that any individual could buy if they chose. That's on the table.
And it's Friday. Mark Shields and David Brooks are here to talk about the health care news and President Trump's war of words with the leader of North Korea. All that and more on tonight's PBS NewsHour. Senator John McCain today dealt a serious blow to Republicans' latest effort to dismantle the Affordable Care Act. In a statement, the Arizona Republican rejected a reform proposal by fellow GOP Senators Lindsey Graham and Bill Cassidy. The move leaves his party's leaders with diminishing hope of repealing President Obama's signature health care law. We get the latest now from our Lisa Desjardins. So, Lisa, what reason did Senator McCain give?
Senator McCain said first, in good conscience, he could not support this bill because he said it's been rushed through, and he thinks now is the time, and this issue is so large that it requires bipartisanship. Let me read one quote from what he wrote. "The issue is too important and too many lives are at risk for us to leave the American people guessing from one election to the next whether and how they will acquire health insurance. A bill of this impact requires a bipartisan approach." So what he's saying here is leaving this up to states for another 2 years is just unacceptable. And moreover, what he wants is a full debate through committee. He wants months and much more thought spent on this issue.
So where does this leave Republican efforts? They have tried again and again and again to get this done.
We've had so many metaphors. This zombie bill, it keeps coming back to life. I think this Republican plan is down on the mat if this was a boxing match and the referee is counting because John McCain was a vote they needed. They can only lose 2 Republicans. He's a hard no. Rand Paul is a hard no. His office confirmed to me today he is still a hard no. Susan Collins today said she is leaning no. We're waiting to hear from Alaska Senator Lisa Murkowski, who supported a bill that did not go as far, who voted no on a bill that was not this broad in scope. So it's very unlikely that this bill will get the support it needs in the next 2 days.
So these are the key Republicans. There have been some bipartisan efforts. Some other Republicans, Democrats have been getting together to see if they could come up with something that could work across the aisle. Where does all that stand?
That's right. When last we were talking about this on the program, we had heard from Senator Alexander, who was leading that effort, that was frozen. The bipartisan effort was frozen. Well, now that might be changing. We heard from Iowa Senator Joni Ernst today, an unexpected voice in this Republican. She told her constituents at a town hall that she wants that bipartisan talk between Murray and Alexander to restart next week. And she said, get this, Judy, today, that she does not think Graham Cassidy will come up for a vote. She does not think the votes are there. And so there is now a renewed attention perhaps to the bipartisan effort. Democrats told me that they actually were ready to make some compromises in that effort. They may have to actually show those cards now if we get to that.
And so it's Senator Patty Murray who's been
correct.
leading the charge on that, Democrat of Washington State, Senator Lamar Alexander of Tennessee. Lisa Desjardins watching it all. Thank you.
Sure.
And in the day's other news, rescuers in and around Mexico City combed through mountains of debris, desperately searching for signs of life. The death toll from the 7.1 magnitude quake has now climbed to at least 293. More than half of those have been in the capital. We'll take a closer look at the scope of the destruction later in the program. North Korea's leader ratcheted up his war of words with President Trump today, warning that he would face consequences, quote, beyond his expectations. Kim Jong-un's statement came days after President Trump threatened to, quote, totally destroy North Korea in his United Nations address. A newswoman read Kim's response aloud on North Korean state TV.
Now that Trump has denied the existence of and insulted me and my country in front of the eyes of the world, and made the most ferocious declaration of a war in history that he would destroy North Korea, we will consider with seriousness exercising the corresponding highest level of hardline countermeasure in history. I will surely and definitely tame the mentally deranged U.S. dotard with fire.
Later, North Korea's foreign minister suggested that they would next test a hydrogen bomb in the Pacific Ocean. President Trump reacted on Twitter saying, quote, Kim Jong-un, obviously a madman, will be tested like never before. Iran's president also had a defiant message for the West today, vowing to continue building up his country's arsenal of weapons. At a military parade in Tehran, a new ballistic missile capable of reaching Israel was unveiled. President Hassan Rouhani spoke to the crowd, pushing back against President Trump, who had singled out Iran in his address at the UN Monday.
Whether you want it or not, we will increase our defensive and military capabilities as a deterrent, as much as we deem appropriate. We will not just strengthen our missile capabilities, but also our ground forces, air forces, and naval forces. For the defense of our country and our land, we will not seek permission from anyone.
Today marked the first time Iran had showcased the medium-range ballistic missile in public, but its military test-fired the same type of weapon back in February. There was word today that the U.S. Department of Homeland Security notified 21 states that Russia potentially targeted their election systems in the run-up to the 2016 election, but most were not successfully breached. Meanwhile, President Trump and the Kremlin are both dismissing reports that Russia planted thousands of paid advertisements on Facebook in a bid to help candidate Trump win the election. Facebook said yesterday that it is turning over copies of the ads to Congress's Russia investigation. This morning, the president tweeted, quote, "The Russia hoax continues. Now it's ads on Facebook." The Trump administration is revoking Obama-era guidelines on investigating sexual assaults on college campuses. Education Secretary Betsy DeVos has said that the previous policy was unfair to accused students. Now, interim rules will permit universities themselves to choose how to handle assault complaints until the Education Department drafts permanent rules. Critics fear that victims will lose protections or feel pressured to stay silent. Former FBI Director James Comey was heckled today while delivering a convocation address at Howard University in Washington. Protesters sang civil rights songs as he took the stage, delaying his speech. Calls of no justice, no peace continued as Comey began his remarks at the historically black university.
It's hard sometimes to find people who will listen with an attitude that they might actually be convinced of something. Instead, what happens in most of the real world, in about 4 rows in this auditorium, is that people don't listen at all. They just try to figure out what rebuttal they're going to offer when you're done speaking.
It was Comey's first public appearance since testifying before Congress about his dismissal by President Trump. Federal officials are investigating reports that Health and Human Services Secretary Tom Price used costly chartered jets for official business. The agency's Office of the Inspector General said today that it's looking into whether the flights complied with federal travel regulations that generally require officials to minimize travel expenses. Price's office said that he sometimes uses chartered planes when commercial flights are not feasible. British Prime Minister Theresa May tried to revive stalled Brexit negotiations with the European Union today. She proposed a 2-year transition period after Britain leaves the EU in March of 2019 to give both sides time to adjust to the changeover. She also indicated a willingness for Britain to pay a financial settlement, but she stopped short of specifying an amount. May spoke today in Florence, Italy.
Let us not seek merely to adopt a model already enjoyed by other countries. Instead, let us be creative as well as practical in designing an ambitious economic partnership which respects the freedoms and principles of the EU and the wishes of the British people.
Brexit talks are set to resume next week in Brussels, but several key sticking points remain, including how much the UK should pay to leave the bloc and how to protect the rights of EU nationals who are living in Britain. London's transportation agency is stripping Uber of its license to operate in the city over public safety and security concerns. The ride-sharing service's license will expire at the end of the month. The regulator specifically took issue with Uber's approach to reporting criminal offenses and the way in which it conducts background checks for its drivers. Uber said it plans to appeal the decision. On Wall Street today, stocks were searching for direction. The Dow Jones Industrial Average lost 9 points to close at 22,349. The Nasdaq rose 4, and the S&P 500 added more than a point. For the week, both the Dow and the S&P 500 added a fraction of a percent. The Nasdaq fell a fraction. And NASA has bestowed a new honor upon Katherine Johnson, the African-American mathematician whose life inspired the hit feature film Hidden Figures. A ribbon-cutting ceremony officially opened a new research facility bearing her name at NASA's Langley Research Center in Hampton, Virginia. The 99-year-old who calculated the trajectories for America's first space flights in the 1960s was on hand for the festivities. What an inspiration. Still to come on the NewsHour, Hurricane Maria's wrath moves on after ravaging Puerto Rico. Search for survivors stretch into the 4th day after Mexico's deadly quake. Senator Tim Kaine on the future of health care reform and much more. Hurricane Maria continued her march across the Caribbean, still as a powerful Category 3 storm. Puerto Rico is dealing with a dam failure in the western part of the island. 70,000 people are in the process of being evacuated. Damage estimates have already reached $45 billion for the Caribbean islands in the storm's path, and all told, at least 27 deaths have been blamed on Maria. John Yang has more.
Across waterlogged Puerto Rico, many of the 3.4 million residents have been forced from their homes. 2 days after Maria made landfall, knocking out power and communications, the personal stories of facing the storm's wrath are just emerging. These women live in Salinas along the southeast coast.
A lot of trees and many houses destroyed and boats on the ground. The power and the water are out. Everything. We don't have anything. We've got nothing, and we don't know for how long we'll go without.
It came when my son said that we've lost everything. It took our house. It's tough, but we're going to start over.
What are you going to do now?
We're going to the shelter.
Governor Ricardo Rossello reports complete devastation. Damage estimates reached $30 billion on Puerto Rico alone. With areas submerged beneath floodwaters, the U.S. military and Federal Emergency Management Agency began airlifting aid, water, food, generators, and temporary shelters.
We're able to fly on our mobility aircraft, firefighters, search and rescue, and other civil support as well. Until probably today, there was no real understanding at all of the level, the gravity of the situation.
Today, Maria kept churning north, lashing the Turks and Caicos. The eastern Bahamas are next, and then the storm is forecast to make a slight turn east into the open Atlantic.
Look at these trees.
Damage to St. Croix and the U.S. Virgin Islands and the tiny island of Dominica was also extensive. Both islands have no power, and curfews are in place to prevent looting. It could take years for some of the Caribbean islands to fully recover from hurricanes Maria and Irma. That includes the nation of Antigua and Barbuda. Sir Rodney Williams is the Governor General. A family physician, he's currently on a medical mission to the United States. He joins us from Annapolis, Maryland. Your Excellency, can I start by asking you what conditions are like now in Antigua and Barbuda?
Well, we're in the phase now where we're trying to rebuild. And the whole question is, how do we deal with the people from Barbuda in particular? Because we are concerned about their well-being, their protection, and their social needs. And the persons from, all the people from Barbuda are now in Antigua, some living with family, some living with friends, and some living in shelters. I must say that the government and the various agencies did a very good job in educating the population prior to and during the hurricane. And now it's time to rebuild. We have actually accommodated the 500 school children in schools in Antigua, and we have also put their teachers to those schools so that they can be feeling comfortable. Presently, the government is working on some accommodation to make them more private and more comfortable. There's restructuring a hotel. There's an old nurses hostel that is being renovated as well. And there's an old Pan Am base on the island that they're putting things in order so that the Barbudans on Antigua and Barbuda can have their own private accommodation. And things are moving along rather smoothly.
And as you say, all the people from Barbuda have been moved to Antigua. How long do you think they're going to have to stay there?
Well, that is a very difficult question for me to answer. A lot will depend on what they find on the ground. Right now, they are cleaning up Barbuda. They have been able to bury the dead animals, and they're cleaning up all the debris on island. And persons from Barbuda have been allowed to go back on a daily basis to protect their assets, and then they return at night to Antigua. There are teams on the ground looking at Barbuda and looking at what is needed. From my understanding, they are trying to ensure that the rebuilding of Barbuda takes into account the type of island that we want to bring back. We have got to develop innovative ways and ensure that we have some of the best engineers and technicians who will advise us to how we rebuild the country, the island, because we're going to have to make sure that the buildings that we put up are durable and that it is sustainable in the long run.
Sir Rodney Williams, Governor General of Antigua and Barbuda, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me on, sir.
As we reported earlier, the death toll in Tuesday's earthquake in Mexico neared 300 today as rain hampered rescue efforts in the capital, Mexico City. In a moment, William Brangham will have a look at how the city has sought to harden itself since the last big quake in 1985. But first, William joins me again tonight from Mexico City. So, William, what can you tell me about the rescue efforts of people who are reportedly are supposed to be trapped in that office building behind where you are?
Yeah, Judy, it is a really extraordinary story that's given people here a lot of hope. Using a whole series of very high-tech technology, thermal cameras, motion detectors, apparently even an Israeli piece of equipment and an Israeli team that was able to zero in on cell phones. They believe that they have found at least six people in that office building behind me that are trapped there, and they are all believed to still be alive. The family members of the missing are camped out just a few yards away from over this way. They have been told, and they are telling the press, that food and water has been able to be sent into these people that are trapped there, but efforts are underway right now to try to get them out.
Well, I know that finding out they're there is one thing, but getting them out in time is something else altogether. What are you hearing about the prospects?
Well, that's absolutely right. It's obviously a race against time. Rescuers have said that they think that they've got 9 different access points that they can use to access where they are, and so they are slowly working their way into it. The tricky part is that's a very fragile building behind me, and as you can see, unlike a lot of the other sites that we visited here, it's not swarming with people. It's just a few people up there because they're worried about collapsing the structure. But the idea is if they can get through one of these access points, they might be able to reach those people inside.
So, William, this is still an active rescue site, but I understand at a number of other sites they've stopped the searching.
Yes, that's right. The Mexican president today said that of the 38 sites that used to be rescue operations, only 10 of them remain active rescue operations. And there's one other larger concern that's been going on here, which is not just for the buildings that have been collapsed, but what to do with the thousands of other buildings across Mexico City that are damaged.
While most of the attention remains on search and rescue across the city, there are an untold number of victims like Silvia Barroso.
I was in the house doing chores when it started shaking. It was really, really strong.
Her apartment wasn't destroyed by Tuesday's quake, but she's been told it's too dangerous to go back and could crumble at any minute. So she now lives here with what soaking belongings she could grab in this leaky shelter inside this vast makeshift community response center.
We're feeling desperate. We really can't go anywhere. We don't have money to rent a new place. Everything has gotten wet from the rain here. There are tons of people coming and going.
There are likely thousands and thousands of people like Barroso. The government estimates that at least 2,500 buildings were damaged on Tuesday, and they've received reports of 4,000 others. These are buildings that weren't flattened, but will likely remain uninhabitable for the foreseeable future. Mexico City, of course, is no stranger to big earthquakes. The worst quake was in 1985, 32 years ago to the day of Tuesday's quake. Mexico City was terribly damaged. Thousands of buildings, including many newer ones, collapsed fully. The official 5,000-person death toll is considered a gross underestimate. After the '85 quake, government officials said reforms would come: better rescue and response, better public education, and stronger, enforceable building requirements. Daniel Rodriguez Velazquez has consulted the Mexican government's Disaster Prevention Board. He's an expert in urban planning, and he says many of those reforms did in fact come.
Las especificaciones técnicas.
Before 1985, building standards didn't consider such large earthquakes. That's been an important change, the stronger building standards for the city.
Many point to the fact that Mexico City largely survived intact from Tuesday's quake. Yes, 45 buildings collapsed entirely, but the vast majority of this sprawling city of over 20 million remains untouched. In fact, on most blocks, it's hard to even tell there was an earthquake at all. Daniel Rodriguez agrees those post-1985 reforms did save lives and save structures. But he worries that in the rush to clean up, the lessons of why some buildings failed will be lost.
We need to see if the buildings that fell met construction standards. There's suspicion that many buildings were built through corruption to bring investment and generate the image of a modern city. We need to have the scientific and technical information to be able to determine the causes of collapses and, when applicable, criminal responsibility.
In fact, just a few blocks away, Rodriguez showed us what he's concerned about. 4 families lived in what was a 5-story apartment building here. It looked like this on Tuesday, and now it's being completely demolished. People here said no investigation had been done. Javier Morales Acosta lived here with his wife, daughter, and grandson. He was at work when the quake struck.
My first thought was of my wife and family. My wife was at home. I tried to call, but she didn't answer, so I knew something had happened.
His wife was injured, but got out alive. She's at the hospital now. He says they've lost absolutely everything.
We haven't been able to recover anything. When something like this happens, the first thing people ask you for is ID, but everything we had is buried.
There's a rush to bring in heavy machinery and clean up the rubble, to demolish buildings. Just like in 1985, it's a political move. The government is in a rush because a presidential election cycle is just starting.
Morales' house and all his family's belongings are being carted away in an afternoon, as officials here face the competing demands of trying to learn from this disaster versus cleaning up and getting back to normal. In Mexico City, I'm William Brangham for the PBS NewsHour.
As we reported earlier, Senator John McCain's announcement that he will not vote for the Graham-Cassidy Republican health care reform bill tosses the fate of current Obamacare repeal efforts into serious doubt. We look at what all this could mean and at a couple of other issues with Senator Tim Kaine, Democrat from Virginia, who was his party's vice presidential nominee last year. Senator Tim Kaine, thank you for talking with us. Let's talk health care first. Senator John McCain's announcement today that he will not vote for the latest Republican effort to overhaul Obamacare, the Graham-Cassidy bill. Is this the death knell for that proposal?
Judy, I wouldn't call it that. Until we get to the end of next week, we have to be very diligent and defeat efforts to repeal the Affordable Care Act, and instead force it back in to the bipartisan discussion that my committee, the Health, Education, Labor, Pension Committee, under the leadership of Senators Alexander and Senators Murray, were having. We owe it to the American public to improve health insurance and health care, but we've got to do it, I think, in a bipartisan way. we were doing it. We were very, very close to a bipartisan deal to stabilize the individual insurance market going forward, but the president and the Speaker and Leader McConnell kind of blew that effort up, at least temporarily this week. So we have to defeat Graham Cassidy, and my hope is, as Senator McCain indicated today, then we'll get back to doing it the way we should, which is in an albeit Republican Senate, but have full discussions in committee with amendments and full debate on the floor. We shouldn't jam something through on health care at the 11th hour that affects the most important expenditure in anybody's life and 1/6 of the American economy.
Well, two other questions on that, because one of the arguments Republicans were making to advocate for this proposal was that states need more flexibility in how they spend their health care dollars. And in fact, there's a Kaiser Foundation study out saying Virginia, your state, would have received something like $4 billion more under this proposal. Isn't that, you're a former governor, why doesn't that make sense?
Well, because it's the reasoning is true. States need more flexibility, but the Graham Cassidy bill is being sold as states need more flexibility. But Judy, every one of the 50 state Medicaid directors said this would be a horrible idea. They said you can't do something like this with no CBO score and people not knowing the consequences, and you shouldn't be cutting this much out of Medicaid. And then second, as for did Virginia benefit? We didn't benefit if you look at the entire 141 pages of Graham Cassidy. There is, in the early years, a slight uptick. If you block grant the Affordable Care Act money to Virginia, there's a slight uptick in that. But then the monies go away completely. So we get a little bit of an uptick in the short term, right. Then all the money goes away. But the real sucker punch for Virginia is this. Separately from repealing the Affordable Care Act, Graham Cassidy goes into the base Medicaid program, didn't have anything to do with Obamacare, was there before Obamacare, and they cap it, and they take $120 billion out of it over the next 10 years. In Virginia, Medicaid recipients, nearly 60% of them are children, and they would have been badly hurt by this piece of Medicaid. So if you look at the whole bill, Virginia gets hurt, and that's why our governor and our Medicaid director are against it.
Senator, several other things I want to ask you about, so I'm going to move through this quickly, but still on health care. You say what's needed is a bipartisan approach, but Senator Bernie Sanders, a number of your Democratic colleagues this past week came out in favor of a Medicare expansion bill that really didn't have the earmarks of bipartisanship. Isn't the Sanders proposal that many of your Democratic colleagues signed on to, that is not a bipartisan approach. So how does that move you in the direction of something that's going to win approval?
Well, let me tell you, Judy, about Bernie Sanders' proposal. He put an idea out on the table, yes, with Democratic co-sponsors. He didn't say vote on it immediately. He didn't say I want to vote before the CBO scores it. Bernie's a member of the HELP committee with me. He's putting an idea on the table. Graham Cassidy is an idea. Fine, it's on the table. Bernie's got one, it's on the table. I would like there to be a publicly offered insurance policy that any individual could buy if they chose, more choices rather than less. That's on the table. But the way to legislate is to first stabilize the market, and we can do that in a bipartisan way. And then once we've stabilized it, we can, with care and deliberation, that is warranted, given the seriousness of health and healthcare to regular people, we can consider the ideas and possibly find concepts from a number of proposals that we can put together to help Americans. So putting ideas on the table is fine, but don't try to jam them through and hurt people with no score, no debate, no amendment, no meaningful opportunity for the public to participate.
Senator, just quickly now, wearing your hat as a member of both the Foreign Affairs Committee and the Armed Services Committee in the Senate, what is your assessment of the heightened tensions between the United States and North Korea this week, with President Trump calling Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, a madman, President Kim, and the leader Kim in turn calling President Trump deranged? What is the state of these relations? How worried should Americans be?
Well, it's very troubling. I will say I'm a fairly frequent critic of President Trump, but I do think the national security team that he has, after a lot of bad people were chased out, is actually now a very solid team. There's no good military option here, but we've got a good military team that is looking at what we need to do to keep the country safe. However, even the Secretary of Defense, Secretary Mattis, says over and over again that we're diplomacy first, we're never out of diplomatic options, and what the president should not do is poison the diplomatic well. Big rhetoric, calling names, that starts to poison the well. And the president is even contemplating backing the United States out of a nuclear deal with Iran. If he does that, when the IAEA and other nations say that Iran is complying with the deal, there's no chance North Korea would do a diplomatic deal with the United States if they felt certain that the U.S. would back out of the deal and not follow it.
Senator Tim Kaine, we thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Stay with us. Coming up on the NewsHour, Mark Shields and David Brooks take on the week's news. And from the NewsHour bookshelf, new reads to look out for this fall.
Read them in a different way as a child.
But let's go right now to Shields and Brooks. That's syndicated columnist Mark Shields, as you just saw, and New York Times columnist David Brooks. The only thing better than seeing you guys once is seeing you guys twice, 3 times.
Just a great treat.
So the health care story, David, the Senate Republicans have been trying so hard to once again resurrect an effort to repeal Obamacare. They thought they were getting, or at least they sounded like they were getting somewhere. But today, John McCain throws down the red flag, says he's not voting for it. Where does this leave all this?
It's, you know, it's pretty grim. Francisco Franco is still dead, to quote that old Saturday Night Live joke.
That's a good one.
Yeah, I should say, first of all, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with having state flexibility and sending the healthcare thing back to the states. We're a diverse country. We might profit from different systems. And there's nothing wrong with reducing the rate of increase in the amount we spend on healthcare. We spend a lot more than other countries. Personally, I'd be happy if we spent a little less on healthcare and a little more on education. But the way the Republicans have done this, yet again, is without a deliberative process in a way that seems to have magically offended every single person outside the U.S. Capitol building, no matter what party, and in a way that raises anxiety on every single level. And so it's very easy for John McCain to say, you haven't followed regular order, you haven't worked with Democrats, you haven't held hearings, and so I'm going to be against this thing. And that's him being very consistent with where he's been over the past several months. And one would have to suspect that Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski will follow suit, and therefore it's down the tubes.
What does it look like to you?
I hate to say that I agree with David, but I agree with David. And I just add this. It's no accident, Judy, that the Republicans find themselves in this position. It's really since the retirement of John Chafee of Rhode Island in 1999, and David Durenberger from Minnesota in 1995, that there's been any Republican senator who has any earned credentials or any deserved reputation for working on health care. I mean, they've just been an against party. That's all. I mean, so who's the sponsor of this? Lindsey Graham. I happen to like Lindsey Graham. Lindsey Graham's credentials, military, national defense. He's worked bipartisan on global warming, campaign finance. Is there Lindsey Graham on health care? And Bill Cassidy, who got to the Senate a year ago. I mean, you know, not exactly a long-toothed, long-term legislator. I mean, all they have succeeded in doing this year is taking the Affordable Care Act, which had always been controversial and never had majority support, and now has majority support in the country. And they've convinced voters that Democrats care much more about health care than they do. And Democrats have an advantage. They believe in Medicare and Medicaid. They believe in federal action. There is no coherent Republican organizing principle or philosophy about health care. Everybody should have it, and it should be private. And I mean, it's an abstraction. It doesn't work in the real world, and voters have concluded it doesn't. And Pat Roberts, to his credit, the senior senator from Kansas, said this is not the best bill possible. It's the best possible bill. And this is the last stage out of Dodge. I mean, because of the quirky rules of the Senate, they need 50 votes until the 30th of September when the fiscal year ends. After that, it's 60. So they're trying to pass something, and they won't.
It's a tough moment for Republicans.
Yeah, I mean, they're caught with a divide. I do think there's a defensible case that an intelligent market-based system could reduce it, cause inefficiencies. There's some models around the world that Republicans and conservative policy wonks can get to point to that. But if you're going to get people to entertain the idea of some sort of reform, you have to give them universal coverage. We're at the point where even a lot of conservative healthcare economists think if we give them universal coverage, you get your pre-existing, you're going to have coverage, then we can work on the reforms. But the Republican Party and the Republican Congressional Party is basically out of touch with their voters. Their voters are not libertarians. Their voters are insecure economically and want some security, and Medicaid and Medicare, and even now Obamacare offers some of them security, and they will not support their own Republican Party when it takes that away.
Well, while we're talking about Senate Republicans, President Trump, Mark, is headed to Alabama tonight to campaign for the man he endorsed in that runoff Senate election down there, Luther Strange. He's the appointed senator. What's made this race so interesting is the man he's running against is Roy Moore, the former state chief justice, who made a name for himself by trying to get the Ten Commandments publicly on displayed in the state Capitol building. This is a race that probably otherwise wouldn't be getting a lot of attention, but Roy Moore is now ahead in the polls. And last night, I want to show everybody just a clip from the debate that Moore and Strange had last night, because Trump's name was front and center. Let's listen.
And I know you may get tired of hearing this, and you may resent that the president is my friend and is supporting me in this race, but I think it's a good thing that the President of the United States has a personal relationship with the junior senator from Alabama.
The problem is President Trump's being cut off in his office. He's being redirected by people like McConnell, who do not support his agenda, who will not support his agenda in the future.
And to suggest that the President of the United States, the head of the free world, a man who is changing the world, is being manipulated by Mitch McConnell, is insulting to the president. That's why he's chosen me.
Mark, what does this tell us about the Republican, the state of play among Republicans in the Senate right now?
Well, first of all, Judy, let's understand this. Alabama, Donald Trump's 6th best state in public polling. He's the most popular there. A leading Republican campaign manager who's deeply involved in this race on behalf of Strange, or at least on the side supporting Luther Strange, told me that they will spend, they being Mitch McConnell's Senate Leadership Fund Political Action Committee, the Chamber of Commerce of the United States, and the National Rifle Association, over $12 million on behalf of Strange against Roy Moore. What it tells me is Luther Strange is presenting himself as Donald Trump's new best friend. And Roy Moore is running as, I am the real Trump candidate. I'm going to go to Washington and let Donald Trump be Donald Trump. He's trying to make it a referendum on Mitch McConnell, who this week in the Wall Street Journal NBC poll was at his all-time low, 11% favorable. And so I think that what Strange's side is counting on is Donald Trump, the president, going there to Alabama and convincing Trump voters who are more comfortable with Roy Moore to vote for Luther Strange.
And meanwhile, the president's poll numbers, David, have ticked up a few points in the last week or two.
Yeah, because he's done something with the Democrats, and bipartisanship is popular, so it's ticked up on there. But in Alabama, the revolution devours its own. You know, he ran as the anti-Washington candidate. Donald Trump did, got to Washington and has to play a little by some Washington rules, which is supporting the guys in the Senate who are supporting you. So he's supporting Strange. Roy Moore is a Trumpian before of all the letter, as they say, before Trump. And the guy who made his name on the Ten Commandments, on some gay marriage issues. Right. It's Alabama. And so he is saying, I'm actually the Trumpian. And so I think what we see for the Republican Party is that this populist tide is not ebbing. If Moore wins, then there's some signs, Alabama's unique, Moore's unique, but there's some signs the party is still getting more populist. And that's caused by two things. First, as Mark said, McConnell is still the enemy for a lot of Republicans. The Washington Republican establishment is still the enemy more than ever. And the things that fueled the populist rise, the rise of the opiate crisis, the decimation of the economy, the white identity issues, all those things are still rising, not ebbing. And so the populism that Trump tapped into may be getting more extreme.
So turning quickly from populism to foreign policy, Mark, the president made his debut, first big speech before the United Nations General Assembly this week, and notable because he came out and said, basically, we will destroy North Korea if they make a wrong move. Does he come away looking more like a statesman? He's followed that with days of squabbling, in effect, with Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea. How do we now look upon President Trump as somebody who's leading foreign policy?
An embarrassment. I mean, you compare the words of presidents in the past, measured, John Kennedy in Berlin, wherever free men live, they come to Berlin, they are citizens of Berlin. Ich bin ein Berliner, Ronald Reagan, Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate, tear down this wall. I mean, they were expressing principle, they're expressing it coherently and lucidly and compellingly, and there was a sense of pride and national direction. That was totally missing. I gave him a B for bombast and bullying and belligerence. I mean, that was a, it was not a speech in which Americans could take pride or direction or comfort.
Yeah, I don't mind a little tough talk. I mean, when Reagan called the Soviet Union the evil empire, he was telling the truth. So, and that's fine. The problem with Donald Trump's, with the rhetoric there, is that it's self-destructive. First of all, it may put the North Koreans in a corner where they can't back down because of their own psychic needs. And it creates a context in which North Korea can test whatever they want to do, apparently, in the atmosphere. And then we weirdly, against North Korea, suddenly we look like the bad guys. And that's the interesting thing about this. The speech was so nationalistic.
Yeah.
If you're the country who's the top dog in the world, which we are, you need international organizations and alliances as a way to extend your power. And if you take that away, you're diminishing your own self. And so his nationalistic pose makes sense if you're Vladimir Putin, if you're a second-rate power. But if you're a top-rate power, it's a self-destructive thing, and we see it here where we actually end up having less leverage rather than more.
So, Mark, what do we look for in the weeks to come? Because right now it's just a war. It is literally a war.
Yeah,
words. I mean, a lot of people are out there listening to this, thinking, "Are we going to go to war?"
I certainly pray not. I hope not. I take some comfort, quite frankly, as a citizen, in your interview with Tim Kaine, the senator from Virginia, who said that he, who had not hesitated to criticize President Trump's policies, had great confidence in the defense team of Chief of Staff, General Chief. I'm sorry. Of Secretary Mattis, General Mattis,
right,
and General McMaster, and General Joe Dunford, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I mean, they provide him what confidence and direction and maturity, and that's our best hope.
So he's surrounded by people who are getting some high marks. Some of them, David.
He's got very good people, but I've been watching the Vietnam series on PBS. And countries can do really stupid things. And the veneer of civilization sometimes gets slender. World War I, there were a lot of very talented diplomats and world leaders at that time, but events just spun out of control. So I don't think we're going to go to war. I still think there's some reason on both sides. But you look at the realm of history, and you have a little cause for concern.
Yeah. And watching the Vietnam series, which is a superb series for any of us who haven't started to watch, you can do that. All right, David Brooks, Mark Shields, thank you both.
Thank you, Judy.
Now a look at some must-reads for this fall. Jeffrey Brown has this special edition of the NewsHour Bookshelf.
And this time we're turning for recommendations to two authors with new or recent books. Louise Penny is author of the popular murder mystery series featuring the Quebec Chief Inspector of Police, Armand Gamache. The latest installment, Glass Houses, was published earlier this month. And Pamela Paul oversees book coverage at the New York Times and is editor of its book review. Her latest work is My Life with Bob, a book about the many books in her life. And thank you both for joining us. And actually, I want to start with a quick question about the books in your life. Louise, what kind of reader are you, and how do you pick what you're going to read next?
I read everything. But you know, the only sadness in my life now is that I can't read crime novels anymore, even though I love them. Because if I read a great crime novel, that's the only book I want to write now, is the book I've just read. And if I read a really bad one, I'm just all upset. And part of my brain is always turned on, of course, trying to figure out how it worked.
Pamela, I know you get millions of books being sent to you every day, so how do you pick what you're going to read?
Well, there's work reading and there's fun reading.
Yeah.
I'm going to focus on the fun reading. I always admire the single-minded dedication of like the hardcore detective novel reader who will just read every single novel in a series or by an author. But I'm like Louise, I'm really omnivorous. And for me, deciding what book to read next is really a question of mood. It's almost like on a gut level, I need to read something and I have to figure out what that book is. And if I try to read something that doesn't sort of match that mood, it doesn't work, it doesn't take, and I end up putting it down.
Okay, our category is new or soon-to-come books, fall books. Louise, you start. Let's take a couple of nonfiction books.
All right, my first choice is Toni Morrison, because I'd read anything by Toni Morrison, of course. If she wrote cereal boxes, I'd collect them. The Origin of Others, which is a collection of essays, and the theme is race. It's about belonging, our yearning to belong, about community, about why race matters even, and how we came up with the concept of other, us and them. And why is it that once we had come up with that concept, are we predisposed to look at the other with suspicion? So that's my first pick. The second one is Daniel Mendelsohn, and his book is called An Odyssey. He is a critic, a reviewer, but he also teaches an undergrad course in Homer's The Odyssey.
Right.
And his father, 81-year-old mathematician, joined one of his courses. And so it's really an odyssey into literature, but also into their relationship. So I'm dying to read that one as well.
Pamela Paul, what are you start with nonfiction for you too?
Sure. Well, I've spent the entire summer, really actually the entire year, doing escape reading. And I think fall is a great time to re-engage. And luckily there are a lot of books, a number of books that really try to take on serious topics that have been in the news, the cultural news, political news, social headlines, and to delve a lot deeper than, you know, the sort of Twitter feeds and headlines have been able to do. So a couple that I'm really interested in are Franklin Foer's new book, which is called World Without Mind, The Existential Threat of Big Tech. Frank Foer was the editor of The New Republic until shortly after it was purchased by Chris Hughes, formerly of Facebook. There was a sort of major falling out between them. But what he does in this book is not just write a memoir about that experience, but really takes on the issue of how technology has sort of infiltrated journalism, the media, and really our daily lives, and what some of the negative impacts of that those changes are. So I think that's one. Another book I'm recommending is Mark Lilla's The Once and Future Liberal, which is a controversial book. Again, you might not agree with all of it, but it's about identity politics, and it's interesting to read that, I think, together with Ta-Nehisi's forthcoming book, which is called We Were 8 Years in Power, which is a lot of the work that he's done in The Atlantic, but it's his first big book since Between the World and Me. And I think together those books take on the issues of identity, race, class, and also electoral politics.
Okay, there's 4 coming books in nonfiction now. Louise, a novel.
All right, Happiness. This is a Canadian one. It is by Will Ferguson.
Which you couldn't resist.
I couldn't resist, I know. You didn't necessarily ask for it. And it's an older one, too. I have to admit
All right,
that.
we're breaking the rules.
We are. I'm going rogue here.
Okay.
I read a lot. I know how cruel the world is, and I read a lot to feel good about it. As Auden said, that goodness exists. So Happiness is a hilarious book about a self-help book that actually works.
We should say the author.
Will Ferguson, of course,
Yep.
Will Ferguson. This book is put out there, and it works so that everybody's emotional ills are actually healed, and everyone becomes happy, except for the publisher, who's thrilled about how many books are being sold, but he's a cynic, and he's trying to figure out who wrote the book and why it works. It is, I highly recommend it.
One other quick
All right, this is by Ayobami Adebayo, and it's called Stay With Me. She's 29 years old. It's a debut. She is a Nigerian, and it is big-hearted, it's lush, it's an exploration of a marriage that starts out loving, begins to have a problem when she can't get pregnant. A second wife is brought in. She gets pregnant, and then all sorts of family secrets are brought out. But I love the fact that it is so big-hearted. So again, it goes in with the happiness thing.
All right, Pamela, Paul, for fiction, are you going happy or tragic on us.
No, it's another book that I think really grapples with contemporary issues, and that's Jesmyn Ward's Sing, Unburied Sing. And
Right.
Jesmyn, I don't know, I feel like she can do anything. Her first novel was Salvage the Bones, and this is her latest novel. They all take place in a fictional town called Beau Sauvage in Mississippi, where Jesmyn Ward lives and where her family is from. It's a bit timely as sort of post-Katrina novels. This is about sort of the people who are left behind and the people who stay behind and why and what their lives are like. And it's about race, it's about class. She has been compared to William Faulkner, Toni Morrison, and Herman Melville in the reviews of this latest book. And while I think she is her own voice, those aren't terrible people to be compared with.
No, they certainly are not. Pamela, let me give you one more, any category you want.
All right. Well, this is about fiction, but it's nonfiction, and that is Bruce Handy's book Wild Things, which is about the joys of reading children's books as an adult. And I am a huge fan of children's books, and I do think that you read them in a different way as a child, and then you read them in a different way with your children, and then if you read them on your own, you also see in them different things. And I think one of the things that he makes clear in his book is that the children's literature is really, that's when we become readers. And those stories really stay with us. And the themes that they raise, whether it's Maurice Sendak's books or the Chronicles of Narnia or Little House on the Prairie, those are stories that really stay with us for life. And he explores why that is and really just the joy of reading them again.
Okay, 8 books to get our readers started, and we're going to have more online. For now, Pamela Paul, Louise Penny, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
On the NewsHour online right now, recognition has not always come easy for Yoko Ono, a conceptual artist and wife of the late musician John Lennon. But this summer, the Smithsonian's Hirshhorn Museum celebrated Ono with a whole season of appreciation. We look at her career and how she's being honored now on our website, pbs.org/newshour. And Robert Costa is preparing for Washington Week, which airs later tonight on PBS. Robert, what do you have?
Judy, Arizona Senator John McCain gave a big thumbs down to the Graham-Cassidy health care bill today. One of the main reasons he wants to work with Democrats on a plan to overhaul health care. Could that happen after 7 years of partisan bickering, plus rising tensions between the U.S. and North Korea as President Trump and Kim Jong-un exchange insults? We cover it all tonight on Washington Week. Judy?
And we will be watching. And tomorrow's edition of PBS NewsHour Weekend, the latest updates from Mexico and Puerto Rico, plus Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel seeks a 4th term in Sunday's national elections.
Andreas Rinka says Merkel's case for a 4th term rests on her leadership of the European Union at a time when the UK is withdrawing from the EU, and American leadership of the West is in doubt on issues ranging from battling climate change to standing up to Russia.
I noticed since I accompany her on her foreign trips that in China, in the US, in the Gulf states, they all said, you are the one responsible for the euro. You are responsible for fixing Europe.
That's tomorrow night on PBS NewsHour Weekend. And we'll be back right here on Monday with a look at the political stakes for health care reform. That's a NewsHour for tonight. I'm Judy Woodruff. Have a great weekend. Thank you and good night.
You're watching